Hi everyone, and you are welcome to the How to Be Irish studio today. I'm your host, Una Harty. How to Be Irish is a podcast which explores Irish culture through guests. So the different guests I have on, they have different expertise, areas of interests, somewhat related to Irish culture or being Irish. Today, I'm so excited to welcome Saoirse Garet. Saoirse is a voice coach and voice facilitator. She has done a lot of research around the loss of the Irish language and its impact on our voice, our bodies, and our communities. There has been a lot of our listeners who have been interested in learning more about the Irish language. We're going to talk about the revival of the Irish language and how that has been happening in recent times, particularly with younger people. You may have noticed that people who are from the millennial and the Gen Z generation in particular are making a lot of effort to try and bring the Irish language back. They're listening to music through Irish, they are watching content creators who create content through Irish, they're reading books in Irish, they're watching films in Irish, and they're listening to podcasts in Irish as well. I hope that you enjoy this one as much as I did. Saoirse Garet is a voice facilitator and accent coach. Since graduating from the MA Voice Studies course at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, she has worked as a lecturer at MTU, Cork School of Music, and as a freelance voice and accent coach with various productions, studios, and voice users around Ireland. Her own research centres around the Irish language and vocal identity. She presented her thesis, Tirgan Changa, Tirgan Anam, How the Decline of Gaeilge Has Affected Irish Vocal Identity, at the Vasta Leeds Integral Voice Symposium in October. She's in the process of devising a workshop that would encourage embodied connection to the Irish language through voice. Saoirse, thank you so much for coming into the How to Be Irish studio today. We're going to talk loads about the Irish language and about your research, which is really, really fascinating. I'm so excited to get into it. I want to start off by asking, though, so maybe something that a lot of people in Ireland have on their minds, maybe now more than ever. Why should we be interested in learning our own language?
First of all, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. I think it just offers something quite unique. So obviously we've had that decline in Irish over the years. And I think there was a stage, I remember being in secondary school and thinking that Irish was kind of useless, that it was a dead language, that there was no purpose to it. And now we've sort of come to a moment in time where we're starting to see a usefulness for it, and we're starting to see that we can find sort of a connection to our history, to our traditions, to insights into the land and our past in the language. So I think that's why people are reaching for it at the moment, is there's just some like a kind of a call for connection and a call for wanting to experience our native tongue as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned connection there. So a lot of your research is about the Irish language and I suppose the connection to our own bodies. Can you just talk a little bit about your research and how you uncovered that?
The research is like, it's so funny to me because it was never something I would have said that I was interested in pursuing. So I went and I did my master's in London. And when I first moved over there, like in the interview for the master's, they had said, like, what would you be interested in researching? And this was not on the table at all. We had a global voice class, just to give context to this whole thing, where we were talking about actor training and how the majority of voice practitioners that we use in actor training are from the UK. And so for me, that was a bit of a light bulb moment of like, why in Ireland are we using UK voice practitioners when, there's this history of colonization there, and we had our voice had been taken away at one point by the UK. So that started a whole snowball thing for me of looking into the Irish language and the voice, which led me also into the body. Just because of that voice body connection, what I kind of came up against or came up to was that these sort of ideas around language and body and voice and body, where we've got voice practitioners who say that, the voice is embodied, meaning that like it is in your body. Language acts as sort of a vehicle between the physical and the emotional. And then we've got like poets who might say that it is more than just an extension of the body, that it is the body itself, and it's the energy and the memories and the needs and the desires of the body. And then going to Mencon Magan's ideas around like Irish being an oral tradition, meaning that at one point in time, it was only carried by the body. There was no writing of it, there was no reading of it. It existed within Irish bodies. That was where it lived, and it waited within the body until it was ready to be vocalized. So those ideas for me really sort of led to this, well, okay, there must be a connection then between the Irish language and the body. If we carried it for so long, there's a point of connection there. And I think that the way that we learn it then in schools feels very disembodied to me, where we sit and read and write. And I know there is the oral, obviously, but there just seems to be this sense of disembodiment and disconnection there because of that real, like almost like, I guess, academic way of learning it rather than an embodied way of learning it.
So you believe that the way that we learn the Irish language through the current education system really does not do it justice, in the sense that it is an oral tradition. Like, as you said, the language lives within the body. What do you mean by that? Could you talk a little bit more about that? Like, how does Irish manifest in our bodies? Like, and does it still manifest in Irish people's bodies? Like, is it kind of almost waiting there, like to bubble up?
I think that's a good question. I'm not entirely sure. I ran a workshop, and within that, we played with Irish from a sort of a voice point of view. So I had printed out words from a poem and stuck them up around the room. We didn't go too much into like meaning. We all sort of agreed on how they sound, but then it was just a case of like breaking them down by the sounds, moving them around the room. And there were responses from participants who said that, like, even though they didn't know what they were saying, there was a sense that the body understood. So this sort of feeling of like the body knows what's going on, there's an energy there that kind of transcends meaning, that there's a deeper kind of connection than just language meaning or word meaning. But I wonder if it is still sort of within us. I think like it is hard to say like, oh, in what way does it kind of live in us? Because obviously we think of language as kind of a bit of an intellectual thing. But at the end of the day, like we're all born sounding, you know? We're born and we yell and we scream, and like what is language but kind of sounds shaped. So I think dissecting language into more of like a visceral thing or more of like a sounding, and that's where I have that connection with voice, that it we see it, if we see it more like a sounding, there's something a little bit more I don't know, like base about it, right? Like that it's sort of just a human need or a human expression rather than speech.
I love that idea of like kind of going back to the origin of language just being a shape of sounds, you know what I mean? And I feel like we see that a lot in today's world, in the way that, you know, we've so many different like subcultures, and within that everyone kind of has their own language. Or like I heard this thing before, and it's like every relationship has its own language, because you're like two people communicating together, and you spend so much time together, so much time communicating, that you kind of end up developing your own language, so that when a relationship dies, a language dies out. I'm like, oh, that's so sad, you know? I suppose to go back to the Irish language, and I mean, to touch on what happened to it when Ireland became colonized by Britain. I know that your research looked at that. Could you talk a little bit around what that meant for the Irish language, and then what it means for it now, in the sense that having gone through decolonization, but the language, it's not recovered at all. We are trying to recover it. So but we'll get into that maybe a bit more about around like how we might go about that. But I suppose maybe more so in how what colonization's impact was on the Irish language.
When I started into this research, I started looking at the history of Irish, and it dates way, way, way back, right? It stems from a primitive Irish. Like there's traces of it from the 4th century AD, but it's around sort of like 1169 or something. We see like Anglo-Norman coming in, and then around kind of it's around the 16th century that we really start to see how colonization is affecting. And what it did was, I think it just was deliberate fragmentation. So this sort of just ties in with like how, with colonization, one of the most important aspects of sort of colonizing a people was colonizing the mental universe. So it was a deliberate act to get rid of a language, because then you're affecting how a community is talking with each other. You're affecting how people even think themselves, like the words that they use to think or the words that they use to describe themselves. So it's a really personal attack, essentially. You get this deliberate fragmentation happening. It starts to decline, obviously. It's kind of beaten out of us. We get the famine, which is another huge event in sort of the decline of the language, where you've got a huge amount of Irish speakers dying or a huge amount of Irish speakers immigrating, where English then becomes what they're moving towards. So Irish becomes like, we're moving away from poverty and failure and starvation. English becomes, we're moving towards prosperity and a better life. I don't think those connotations have really gone away. And I think that's something that we're still seeing, like that negative view of Irish as being kind of old or backwards, or, that it doesn't have a use. All of these things, those really negative ideas around it stem from then. So we're going back like 200 years. And then after the famine, you do get a little bit of like a revival, where the Gaelic League obviously made leaps in sort of bringing the language back a little bit. But then, because it was so associated with like a free Ireland, when that goal was achieved in 1922, people were like, oh, well, we're kind of done with the language now. It was sort of like, it became really a nationalist thing. And then when they didn't have that need for it anymore, it kind of just faded away a little bit. And so I think that's where we still see that, like, for the most part in society, well, maybe not so much anymore, but for a while anyway, it just felt sort of symbolic, the Irish language. Like, you see it on signs, you hear it in transportation announcements, but it's always alongside English, right? In Cork and Dublin, like, it's always alongside English. So it just sort of feels like a nod to, we had that one time, and like, here it is now again, you can have a look at it. But it never felt like, well, we're bringing it back to use it. And I do think that a lot of people still really feel a distance towards it. And like, I'm sure a lot of people feel like a dislike towards it, just because of all of those negative connotations in the past.
That's really interesting. I never knew about the overall history of the Irish language. I think I would have maybe assumed that when we had the Celts and other ancient people in Ireland, like, would they have been speaking a form of Irish? Like, what would they have been speaking? You mentioned around 4 AD and such.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. I think, like, sort of what we think of as modern Irish, we see a rough form of that from 4 AD, but then that is coming from the primitive Irish, and that is coming from Indo-European language. I read that it's the third oldest written language besides Greek and Latin. The fact that it stems from Indo-European, I know that Menkon Magan is writing a book about the ties between India and Ireland, because they're sort of stemming from the same tree, which I just think is fascinating. So it goes back a long way. And I'm sure then, like, it's been influenced by other groups coming in, other languages coming in. So the Irish that we see today is obviously super different from maybe what we saw 2,000 years ago. But that's sort of just a rough history of it.
I've heard about Mancon Magan talking about the connections between the Irish language and Indian languages, like the word for cow being pretty much the same, for example. I know there's like tons of others, and even just our real ancient history, or like the mythology that we'd have would have a lot of similarities. It's really interesting. So I'm thinking about, we have this kind of term, Old Irish, and you see the chevu would be marked with a dot above the letter, for example. When did we transition into like the Irish that we would like write today? Was that to do with the Gaelic League and they were trying to modernize the language?
I know that the Gaelic League and the Society for the Preservation of the Irish Language, which was before the Gaelic League, they really worked to root it in the now. So there was I know there was a periodical that talked about current affairs, and that was really important because it was sort of maybe not the first time, but they were like writing about what's happening right now. So rather than it being like, oh, we're writing about myths and old stories of 100 years ago, it's like, well, here's the language for what is current. We do see, obviously, with those newer that feel maybe a little bit anglicized sometimes, where you get like a mobile phone being a phone polka, like phone and phone being like sounding the same, obviously being written different. But so maybe that's where we're seeing a little bit of evolution in.
I love that term bearlicus. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but the idea of like the Irish word for something, but it clearly was invented recently, as the object was invented recently, like wardrobe is vordrus, for example. And people be laughing about these ones like table tabla as opposed to like board, you know? It's like people use the term bearlicus to describe this idea of it's a real lazy translation, but like it makes sense in the way because these things did not exist. Like you said, a mobile phone, like they didn't have that. So obviously, and that happens in other languages as well. Like it's a natural thing to happen. I think that's very interesting about the Gaelic League you mentioned as well there. And you were talking as well about how people almost viewed like I suppose around the famine, you said people still viewed Irish as maybe like more of a backwards thing. They were looking to English as a way to progress, and obviously like loads of people either emigrated or they died as a result of the famine. And that really, you know, we think about the famine as something which destroyed Irish people, but we don't really think about it as something that destroyed the Irish language as much, or at least that might be my own perspective. But I mean, that is so important. If you do destroy the people, you destroy the language with it. You know, these things, you know, they coexist. To get more into your own research, Saoirse, and related to voice and the Irish language, can you talk a little bit more about that and like what you actually uncovered in terms of us losing Irish and how that has affected our voice as Irish people?
So I think I had originally kind of come to the research being like, well, yeah, it's definitely had some sort of effect. And I wanted to find out to sort of what degree it had an effect. And I think now looking back, sort of, you know, after writing the thesis and finishing that, like what I really discovered was that it kind of doesn't matter the degree, because any sort of amount of colonization is going to impact people, and any impact made is going to leave scars and trauma for the generations that follow. But so what I really found in looking at how the decline of Irish has affected vocal identity in particular is that there's sort of three areas of disconnect. So we get this disconnect from community. So you have that fragmentation of language. How do we think? How do we talk with each other? That disconnects us from our community, which also, you know, disconnects us from the land, which is sort of a subsection maybe of that, where we had all these terms for what happened in the land and the events and the memories, and there's a disconnect from that. Then there's a disconnect from the body. So what I was talking about with, you know, language in the body, that connection there, that we're not maybe as connected to our bodies as we could be. And then in the way that we learn Irish only sort of furthers that disconnect. And the third disconnect being a disconnect from self. So, which is sort of just a combination of the first two, that we sort of, like, our self is defined, you know, by who we are surrounded by, like the community that we're surrounded by, our lived experiences, socioeconomic and cultural upbringing, all of those things helps us to define ourselves. And then it's ourself is how we express ourselves. And so if we've got a disconnect from the body, a disconnect from community, we're going to have a disconnect from ourself. So those were the three things that I had come to the conclusion of. And then I had been really curious about how Irish might help us connect to our voice. So I thought that maybe in speaking Irish, we would find sort of an ancestral voice, a connection to elements in our voice, because, you know, as well as the loss of ideas and traditions that we get with language, we also lose like sonorous practices, right? So like sounds that we don't make anymore because we don't speak Irish anymore. So I thought, okay, in speaking Irish, maybe we'll uncover something with the voice. Now, what I actually am more interested in is how voice can help us connect to Irish. So I think it does have a use, like speaking Irish, kind of we play with different resonances, different pathways. There's something kind of exciting and different there, that Irish gives us something new in the voice. But actually, I think that using voice exercises, vocal practices to help in the learning of Irish or engaging with Irish is more useful and can help to foster that embodied connection that I think people are looking for.
I've so many questions coming into the mind off the back of that. But I suppose to begin with, as somebody who doesn't really know much about voice and maybe terminology around that, could you explain a little bit what you mean by, is it sonorous? Is that the term you used? Is that just like the sounds that we create?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So like I deal with spoken voice. I work with actors, I work with voice users, anyone who uses their voice a lot. I deal with the spoken voice and accent work. So when we talk about like sonorous practices, it's just like a fancy way of being like, there are lots of different sounds that we make, and we can get really technical with the terms of bilabial plosives and all the rest of it. But like, there are bits of the Irish language that we probably don't just engage with so much, just because they're not really a part of English. So I think
Okay.
that they kind of are useful, to just explore different ways of sounding, but that also, that the voice maybe would help us to find those as well a little bit.
Okay. So what you're saying is that by losing Irish, we're losing out on some kind of sounds that we maybe used to make, unless we find a way to teach it in that sense. Is that what you're kind of saying? Like if we teach it with that true sound?
Yeah, exactly. Like when we sit, I feel like I don't remember anything from secondary school, but when you sit in an Irish class, like you are going to make some of those sounds. I don't remember going all in on pronunciation, Like I felt like I just sort of said the words. Like I don't think I ever really like felt the words. I don't think I ever really meant the words. And I don't think I committed to maybe what their correct sound should be, or, what maybe a more traditional sound would be. But I think that, yeah, in not speaking them so often, they're just like missing from the sound world. And the more sort of sounds that we've got out there, like the more that we can play with those things. Like I think it's all just play at the end of the day, that we can these different sounds and explore, what does that wake up in us? What does that inspire in us? Like what can we feel or learn from it?
I totally see where you're coming from, in the sense like I'm an Irish language speaker. I wouldn't be fully fluent now, but I went to an Irish language secondary school. And as a result of that, my Irish is at a level where I can, hold a conversation. My grammar's not going to be perfect, but because I would speak in Irish far more than I would read or write in Irish now, I do feel like my pronunciation is something that I focus on more than anything. And I get what you're saying, the idea of like I get so much enjoyment out of like trying to pronounce those sounds. You've got like two consonants coming together when there's like an aru situation, or like when you're adding in a chevu, is like that real like kind of, there's fun in that, in like going for that pronunciation. There's great joy in it, as you say. It's the same for any language, and you get to the point where you're comfortable enough in it, you can start to have fun with it, and you can lean into the accent, you can lean into the proper way of pronouncing things. And yeah, you're right. In school, I really don't remember there being too much of a focus on like pronouncing something the right way. It would have been more so to pronounce it so that you can hear the grammar happening, which in a way is so sad. That's so medical. It's so like clinical. So you touched on there about like learning the Irish language and how we do learn it here in Ireland in school, and that really does not help the preservation. Not even, I want us to go beyond preservation. I want it to thrive. Like, we should be beyond preserving. It's here. We speak it. It's alive. We're going to thriving now. Okay. What should we be doing in terms of learning Irish so that we can make the language thrive? Do you have any thoughts on that?
We need to get rid of the concern around preserving it, because I think that's a really big hurdle. There are people out there who out of a love, out of such a love for the language and a care for it, are really kind of strict about its rules, right? Because they want to keep it alive and they want it to be perfect. And I think that that's so fair, right? Like, obviously, we want to maintain it, but I think we kind of have to throw it out the window a little bit.
Mhm.
And I think we have to just totally make mistakes with it. And I know you were saying about how when you get to that level of comfort, you can have fun with it, you can play with it. But I think we should get to play and have fun with it before we're even comfortable with it. And I know like that's so can be so hard to do, but I do think we need to sort of invite the idea of play and of making mistakes in learning the language. And I'm not sure, like, I mean, again, when I first came to this research, I was like, we should all be bilingual. I was really gunning for everybody should be fluent and we should all, but I don't think it's necessarily practical for everybody, do you know? And I don't think it's not, I don't think it's what everybody wants necessarily. Like, I think a lot of people out there just want to feel a connection to it. And what's going to turn them off doing that is if we start putting loads of emphasis on grammar and comprehension. And now you're analyzing poetry and prose, even though you don't understand it. And like, that is just going to turn people off of it. And so I think we have to I think, strip it back to like, how do we talk to each other? That's all we want to do, right? Is like communicate with another person and and have a connection there. So I think we make it more about people. I think we make it more about voice in talking and speaking. And I think we take the pressure off getting it right. I think trying it at all is better than not. And I know like I feel like such a hypocrite sometimes because I talk about all this and I think about it all the time. And then I went to this event where there were loads of fluent Irish speakers. And I was so excited to be there and I had such a great time and I was so inspired. But their level of fluency, I just didn't try to speak. I just didn't speak at all. And then when people spoke to me, I would try a little bit and then I would get shy and I would be like, oh, sorry, I don't have any. Most of them were super nice. Most of them were like, well, let's just try it slow. Like, let's give it a go. And I think that is the most important thing, is to just try it and to make mistakes and play with it.
I couldn't agree with you more, Saoirse. Like, I think that is actually probably one of the biggest problems with the Irish language today is it breaks my heart to say it, but I think there's a lot of people out there who speak Irish and speak it fluently and they're protective over, as you said, that they want it perfect. They want it to be preserved perfectly. And I totally respect them for that. I understand that. Like, do you know what I mean? I really do. But at the same time, like, we have to welcome imperfections. We have to welcome that fun. We have to, like, I honestly feel like so emotional even talking about this right now because you were talking, you went to that event with all the fluent Irish language speakers, like, and I said, look, I went to an Irish language school, and even in college as well, I lived in an Irish language house, and I would have spent a lot of time talking to people through Irish. Even with that, I would be terrified going into that event that you went to, because I've been in that position where they're there correcting your grammar, and you're just going like, I'm just trying my best.
And it is really vulnerable to try and speak a language, like when you don't have the words that you need or want. And it can feel really exposing. It can feel like it's nerve-wracking. You're trying to communicate with somebody, and if they're shutting you down with like, oh no, that's wrong, immediately you're going to be like, oh well, I actually don't even want to try, so, because you're just shut
Mhm.
down.
Exactly. That's it. It's going to actually really do more damage to the language in the long run. And we're at a point now where things are looking really good. Like as you said, I think there's a lot of people playing with the language. There's people on TikTok and they're recording their days in the life through Gaeilge, and they are not at all fluent. They are doing their best, and it warms my heart to see it. And there's people who are throwing a couple of focal into some written pieces here and there, say if they're writing poetry or if they're writing a story, or even just if sending a text into a group chat. It's so important to just try and play with it and have a bit of fun with it. Whenever I'm going to meet someone, I'll always like text them, I'll be like, Beag nach ann, like I'm nearly there. as opposed to I'm nearly there, because these little things like that, I'm like, where can I kind of bring it in? Like, for example, water bottle. I will never, ever, ever use the word bottle. I always say bujel. Like, I don't know why my brain like just won't allow me to say bottle. I think it's little things like that we need to do, and everyone should have a go at it. Like, let's start saying "Oh, Cadagum Dulgaji" and Leharis again. Like, why not? Like, let's have some fun with it. I think it can really, really help the language. What would you say to somebody who is listening to this and they know the Kupla Fuckle, but they don't really know what to do next? I've had that question from a lot of people now, but I'm curious to hear your perspective. I feel like I'm sending people towards Duolingo as an easy resort, but there's got to be other ways that, and as you said, it's the voice. We need to use the voice. So how can they interact with Irish, like in an oral sense, if they don't feel confident in it?
I do think Duolingo is good. Like I'm doing the Duolingo now as well. And I think it's about finding somebody maybe who's on the same level as you. If you're feeling nervous about it, like I know a friend of mine, like we'll do a breakfast la Colini and we'll do a little like chat on there. And, she's got words that I don't know. I've got words that she doesn't know. We kind of come together and we can share with each other. And that way we're learning from that. And I think we've got more than we think we do. And so it's about sort of like rooting through the little boxes of our brain and being like, oh yeah, I remember how to say that. I remember how to say that. Because it's a muscle, really, at the end of the day. Like it's something that we can build on and we can sort of strengthen. So I think finding someone who might be on the same level as you if you're feeling nervous. When I went to that event, somebody really recommended to me that I get in touch with somebody who's more fluent than I am, so that I could learn from them. I have gone to more events in Cork. I went to, oh gosh, what was it called? I think it was called Cushcane. And that was really great. That was like we did some meditation. We talked about Irish. There was some singing. We did a little bit of that. I've gone to some Kirkukaintas, and I feel nervous every single time. I feel really nervous. And sometimes it's a case that like me and my partner are sat in the corner just being like watching and taking it in and talking with each other. But I think kind of have to feel the fear and do it anyway in some of those situations. I talk to myself in Irish a lot. When I do it by myself, when I think in Irish, when I speak to myself in Irish, that's where I have the most fun. Like that's where I feel so like expansive and free and like I could totally play with it because sure nobody's listening and to myself I'm totally right and I understand what I'm saying, so that's fine. Even just like talking to yourself, maybe watching, listening. I've been listening to a lot of obviously I've listened to a lot of Kneecap, like who hasn't? And just kind of giving yourself like little things that you like to do or like to hear, like to see that are in Irish. Because there's no point forcing yourself, like, I should watch this because it's in Irish, because it's just not gonna work. It's not gonna sink in.
People always say, try and listen to things, but try and listen to something that you're interested in. It doesn't have to be the TG Cahir Nuacht that you're listening to. Listen to Kneecap, watch the Kneecap film, go and find some podcasts that maybe talk about current affairs or pop culture or sport. Whatever you're into, find that thing that you're already going to be interested in and then find it through Irish, because there's so much people who are trying to create events like you mentioned, like Kirkle Choras, and it's just amazing that they are there. You just need to look a little bit to find them. What do you think about people who say that Irish is a hard language to learn and they don't want to bother?
I think that that's a view that I had for sure. And that's actually a question that I had asked one of the people that I interviewed for my thesis. She's Australian, she's got Irish and Welsh heritage. And I said, like, do you find it really hard to learn? And she was like, well, no, it's not hard, it's just different. I think maybe we need to change our mindset around it. That it isn't. It's just a different language, like it's just different sounds, it's different structures, it's different rules. And I know that some of them are tricky. And I remember thinking like, oh well, this doesn't make any sense. But like actually I think if we sit and we examine it, like there are patterns and there are rules that do make sense. So I think it is a mindset shift. I actually think a lot of the work around the Irish language is sort of a mental work to be done, of like an awareness and an unlearning in some ways. And so I think it is just like well, this is just different to how I usually speak or to what I usually know.
Absolutely. It's the same with learning any language. It's a vulnerability, and you have to expect that there are going to be sounds that are going to be different, that you're not going to be used to, and that two letters are going to go beside each other, and you're going to say, why the hell is there an M and then a B? I don't understand. It's a mindset thing, as you said. I've lived abroad now for a while, so I thoroughly enjoy educating people about the existence of the Irish language. Not just the fact that we can speak Irish, but the fact that it actually exists. Because people are completely unaware. They think that Irish is a dialect of English. Maybe sometimes when people go to learn Irish, as Irish people, they maybe expect the same thing. It's a completely different language, you know? So you have to be ready for those different sounds. And again, we're going back to the play, have fun with it, you know, lean into it, make those mistakes and be vulnerable. You mentioned in some of your research that you compared Irish to some Indigenous languages. I'd love to hear more about that and what you uncovered.
That was such a big inspiration for me. I think Indigenous researchers have done so much work around that, and I admire them so much. I really drew from so much of their knowledge, and so that was a huge inspiration for me. It's something I want to explore like further. I think it's so there's so much there. In my research, I sort of made comparisons between the decline of Irish and the way that other Indigenous languages had declined or had been erased. And so what I found is that like Irish and Indigenous languages are similar in the sort of linguistic qualities of like being really rooted in nature. So there's a real like rooting in the natural world, in the other world, that spiritual world. They both share a lot of, they've got vocabulary for that. They've got like rooting in it. And then looking at that decline in those Indigenous languages, like we saw how colonization affected that there was that disconnect there. Looking at the way that they were deliberately erased and the way that Irish was deliberately erased, it's a sort of shared experience. And while their general experiences under colonialism or imperialism is different, because obviously we don't want to conflate the experiences of all peoples, I think that just deliberately getting rid of a language has a negative impact on the group. So our, especially with the voice, where like when I see the voice as really impacted by society. So there are like different ways, obviously, of approaching voice and theories about voice. But I think that because our bodies are kind of marked by society and our voices are marked by society, when we see that in Indigenous cultures as well as here in the Irish culture, where the language is eroded or changed or shifted, there's a change in the community. And so then there's a change in the voice. And so that for me was a real shared experience between them. I guess in sort of me trying to prove or give evidence to the fact that Irish, the decline of it did impact our communities, I looked to Indigenous communities and their experiences and said, well, that our experience was similar to that.
Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned as well about the lack of connection to self as a result of it. Do you think that as Irish people, we have been impacted from a mental health perspective as a result of that lack of connection to self from losing our language?
I do think so. One of the quotes that I had seen, I guess tying that into the Indigenous peoples, was that the trauma of colonization has been passed down genetically to the point that Irish people share a high level of dysfunctionality with other groups around the world, like Native Americans or Maori or Aboriginal people. So I think that there is like a the body keeps score. I think there's a trauma there that we probably we do hold. And mental health wise, I think, it can be really isolating, right? When you don't have a language. And I think we are, experiencing that which has been passed down.
You mentioned as well disconnection to the land, and if we lose words which describe the weather, what the sea is looking like today, what that hill looked like yesterday, what the sky will look like tomorrow based upon the way the birds are flying or whatever. I mean, I think it's so sad because it's like Irish people were very connected to the land and we are less connected now as a result. And I think because of climate change, it's kind of more important than ever for us to become reconnected to the land. So in a way, if we reclaim our language and we use it more, do you think that will help us to feel empowered when it comes to our care for the land, and therefore maybe like working towards resisting climate change?
I think it's a good question. I think it helps us to understand the land better. The example I always used was all those words for field, right? And
Mm-hmm.
how Raylon is a field for dancing, or mean is a smooth field or whatever. That like the English word field doesn't hold all that information. That we have words that hold like, what kind of field that is, what takes place there. And so I think maybe if we're engaging with the language, we can know more about our surroundings. We can know more and better understand the history of the land or what it was used for, and have a better appreciation, better awareness, which, yeah, I think in turn is going to make us better sort of carers of the land if we better understand it. I mean, I'd love to think that it would play a role in sort of how we're dealing with climate change, and that connection to the land is going to give us a care that will mind it a little bit better.
Another thing that Irish people are known for is storytelling. And I've mentioned storytelling a good few times on this podcast before. Do you think that our loss of our voice has meant that we are not as good storytellers anymore?
Ooh, no, I actually don't. I think we're great storytellers, and I think that has passed into the way we speak English. So I think we were, again, I think that's something that was probably passed down genetically. Is it was an oral tradition. We had to be able to tell great stories. We had to be able to speak about, the things that we had done. We couldn't capture that, and that, we feel that in the music as well, right? That we're
Mm.
sort of very sound based people, right? Between music and storytelling. But I think we still have that. I totally think we still have that. I think that's such a feature of being Irish. Like I feel like every Irish person I know is just good at talking, like good at like talking about things. And so then I guess that kind of comes into like our Hiberno English, right? Which is
Mhm.
our distinctive dialect of English, where it's really influenced by Irish, where we've got this version of English. It's not standard, it's not the standard English. I mean, I lived in London, and people pick up on it. They don't understand why you've structured a sentence like this, and they don't understand why you put a word here. So I think we still have that, almost that energy of Irish sometimes in our English, where we've got little Irishisms, we've got different grammar, we've got a different way of playing with it. And it's really expressive and it's really playful. And we've sort of taken something that was imposed upon us and said, like, well, here's our version. And I think that really helps us to be great storytellers.
I love Hiberno English. I think again it's a lot of fun. My friend, she's from Belfast and she's learning Irish at the moment, and she oftentimes would ask me, how would you go about saying that, for example, in Irish? We were in the shop the other day, and I said, she says, how would you describe the people who are shopping, like shoppers, like what's that word? And I said, well, I actually wouldn't really have a word for shoppers. I would say Nadini and me and Ig Shoppadoric, the people that do be shopping, you know? And I never thought about it. Like, I was like, well, there's your Hiberno English. I do be doing that. Or, as you mentioned, I suppose the kind of way you use verbs or whatever, how you might structure a sentence is definitely, it's distinct and it does catch people's attention. We love to use like in a very different way to a way maybe an American might use in their English. It's nice to know that that tradition has been carried on through the way that we are being playful with the English language. If you were the Minister for Education, Saoirse, and you were tasked with reinvigorating how Irish has been taught in schools, knowing what you know about the language and voice, what would you do? What changes would you make? Would you make Irish compulsory?
Ooh, that's such a good question. I wonder, would people do it if it wasn't compulsory?
Mm.
I think me myself at 15, 16, I would have said, I'm going to do something else. I think I probably wouldn't have. But I also get that, like, in sort of forcing a subject, that it is going to make it like you're not going to want to engage with it. So I guess if it wasn't compulsory, you're going to get groups of people who do really want to be there. I don't know. I think that's a hard call. But if I was to change the sort of the content, I think I would just really strip it back to talking, to speaking with each other, and to putting the emphasis on that. For me, that leaving cert like syllabus of the poems and the short stories and the Schra Picture, like all of that, it's like, when am I ever going to use? And that was what I thought then. I was like, when am I ever going to talk about this again? When am
I
I ever
know.
going to use this again? Like, having it being a living language outside of the classroom is super important. I don't know if just having it in a classroom automatically, like, does it just disconnect it immediately because you're in school and school sucks? I don't know. I'm not sure if the classroom environment, I just feel like it's not the right place for it to like flourish, you know? I feel like for it to be living, to be celebrated, to be sung and spoken and felt, sitting down in a chair in a uniform isn't going to encourage that very much. I am very for the Gael skulls, and if I ever have children, like I definitely would be putting them in like an Irish speaking primary school, secondary school, because then you're experiencing it all the time, right? And it's not like you're not learning Irish so much as you're learning life in Irish. So I think maybe there's an element of that that's needed.
I think it should be compulsory, because I would worry that if it wasn't compulsory, that people would choose to not do it, and that would almost have more damage in the long run. I don't know exactly what the situation is now, but I know there would have been a lot of people exempt for different reasons. I think that also is a bit of like, I'm like, you're not exempt from other subjects. Like, do you know what I mean? I'm like, why are you exempt from Irish? Oftentimes, I've heard people who might be dyslexic. You can be dyslexic in one language and not in another, you know? You could be dyslexic in English and not at all in Irish. So I'm like, it doesn't really make much sense to exclude them, you know? I'm like, you're actually excluding them from this opportunity in a way.
And again, if we took that pressure off the reading and writing, it's not going to maybe have as big an impact on those who are dyslexic, dyspraxic, like, neurodiverse. If we're speaking, like we can all express to some extent. But yeah, no, I do agree with that sort of thing of like, because I think even when I was in school, like I was born in America, and there were people that were like, "Oh, well, you don't have to do it," and I was like, "Well, but I've lived here since I was 2. I did it the whole time. So why would I just like, why would that make me exempt if I was there for like 2 years as a baby?"
Literally, there's people who come to this country in their teenage years. They might not even have done the junior cert here in Ireland, and they might not do Irish, but they do all the other subjects, and English is certainly not their first language, and they absolutely excel. I think you should always give somebody the opportunity to do that, and you shouldn't say, "Oh, well, it's too hard, but it's okay, you don't have to do it." Okay, maybe I'm in a bit of a bubble, but there's definitely a new renewed interest I can see on social media. Why do you think we are so excited about Irish at the moment?
I think it's sort of a coming together of a lot of different things. Um, I don't know what has kind of placed us in this like perfect storm of like there's just like a want for it. And it wasn't there. I mean, I'm trying to think like when this even started, maybe around the pandemic. It
Mhm.
wasn't there like 6, 7 years ago, I don't think. Sometimes I wonder, like, is it just me? Like, am I just really looking for this stuff? But no, I think there is like a want for it, like an excitement about it, and I do think that it's coming from it becoming more contemporary. So, like like Kneecap, their music is of the now. We're not talking about sort of very traditional Irish music or like something that feels old. They're rapping. It feels present. It feels current. I think a lot of the other stuff that we see that people are engaging with, I think it's because it feels present. And I think a really big thing that was a struggle for Irish, or that put us at a distance from Irish, was that, the voice speaking Irish, or the words that we say in Irish, whatever it is, that felt not like us because it didn't feel contemporary, right? That was an experience that some people in the workshop had. That's an experience I've heard from people I've talked to, where they're like, "Oh, when I speak Irish, like I don't sound like myself. I don't sound like me. I sound old. I sound like I'm from the past. Like, who is that version of me?" So I think that was something we really struggled with like, oh, well, I don't identify with the version of me that speaks Irish. Whereas now there's sort of the material there, the content there that we're like, oh, I actually see myself in this version of Irish. It's contemporary, it's new, it's happening now, it's young, it's fresh, whatever. Like there's an element of me in it rather than it's 100 years ago, it's history, it's whatever. I think that's why we're seeing that excitement there. And it feels like we can resonate with this version of Irish.
It kind of reminded me a little bit of what you said earlier when they were trying to revive it back in the early 1900s, how they would have started to have like a periodical talking about current events. Let's stop looking back. Let's just look forward. You're going to facilitate a workshop around the Irish language and voice. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So as part of my research, I used a workshop. Like I trained as an actor and now I'm a voice coach. Everything I do is extremely practical. I had to have a workshop. And so what that looked like was we did a bit of a voice warm up and then we used sort of different text exercises to engage with a poem. But those exercises were from UK voice practitioners because at the time, like that's what I was engaging with a lot. What I'm really interested in now is I'd like to see how we could draw from our own traditions and culture, and devise exercises that might help us to sort of vocally engage with the Irish language. I'd also like to look at global majority voice practitioners or Indigenous voice practitioners who might have traditions that would resonate with us and vocal practices that would resonate with us, exercises that would resonate with us. I think it's really interesting that I'm seeing loads of Irish being used within like yoga circles, and lots of like Celtic tradition being used within that community of like yoga, breath work, somatic dance, all the rest of it. Like I think that community is really used to engaging with like body, breath, and voice in a different way. And it's kind of easy to incorporate Irish into that because you can use breathwork and yoga, which is like voice is essentially like breathwork, yoga with voice on top, trying to sort of shape what that would look like. But I would like it to be kind of exploratory, sounding, drawing from different sources, and just be a way to sort of a space to play and talk about Irish. If it happens or when it happens, it'll be in Cork for sure.
Brilliant. Well, keep me updated. I might be finding myself in Cork soon, so I'll definitely be interested. If somebody is listening and they're interested, they can get in contact with you. I'll leave your information in the show notes. I'm going to close the interview with our final questions here, Sha. For you, what does it mean to be Irish?
So I've been thinking about this question a lot. And I was listening to your other podcasts, and I loved what Emily said about graw and that openness. I've really experienced that, like living in other places, that here in Ireland, like we just have an awareness of others, and a real openness to them. But I also think, and I guess I've said it so many times today, is that I think Irish people are really playful, but not in sort of like in a really informed way. Like it's playful in the face of like, it's a tenacious way. I think the pinnacle of Irishness is like the wake, the funeral, the way that we are in the face of death is a really good example of who we are as people. And I think that is like we see things that are hard, we've been through things that are hard, but we've still maintained like a sense of fun, a sense of lightheartedness, a sense of community. It's like when we come up against those tough situations, that we go to those things like community, tradition, the games and the songs of the wake. Like, I think that as Irish people, we just have a sense of lightness there that kind of helps us through the hard stuff. And for me, that's, I think, what it really is to be Irish.
I think Alva touched on that a little bit. It's like, how can we use our wit to face some of the biggest challenges that we have in the world today? How can Irish people use that tenacity to deal with difficult situations, and that we do, and we come together in that sense as well.
Thanks so much for having me. And I think like what you're doing is amazing. Like I loved listening to your other episodes.
Oh, Gurv, mila mila mahagat, Saoirse. I really appreciate you coming on today and sharing your research and just having a good old discussion about the Irish language. Nothing better really on a Wednesday morning. So thank you so much. Slán, thank you so much for listening to How to Be Irish. I really appreciate all of you who follow the podcast. We have over 300 followers on Spotify alone now. We've had a great response to the recent episodes with Alva Smith, for example, and with Emily O'Driscoll as well. So thank you so much for tuning in. I'm absolutely delighted. I love facilitating these conversations with Irish people about Irishness, and I want to continue doing that. So your support means a lot. And if you do enjoy the podcast and you get something out of it, then I would recommend that you follow the podcast on Spotify or wherever you do listen to this podcast. If it's on YouTube, please give me a like, a thumbs up, and subscribe to the channel. Share the episode with a friend. Throw it into a group chat there, why don't you? We are now nearly 10 episodes in. I cannot believe it. My initial plan was to have 10 episodes and that would be the first season, but here we are, nearly 10 episodes in, and I don't see us stopping. So I'm going to keep going as long as I can, and then I will probably take a break. So Gurv mila mila mahagwib from me, from the bottom of my heart.